I am live. I'm reading chapter 4 now, Exits of Prelude to the Landing on Planet Earth, published 1977 by Stuart Holroyd. He describes the journey between or with Dr. Andrija Puharich, Phyllis Schlemmer and Sir John Whitmore. We had a change of channels, and this is about communication from extraterrestrials. Chapter 4, Exits. Among the precursors of the New Age consciousness and orientation was Dr. Roberto Assagioli, who shortly after the turn of the century started to develop the concepts and techniques of psychosynthesis. All through the decades, when the majority of psychologists following Freud focused their attention on the pathology of the psyche and on the development of techniques of therapy that sought to adjust individuals to a socio-cultural norm, Assagioli worked in comparative obscurity, developing his integrative model of the psyche and techniques of individual growth. That he was indeed ahead of this time would seem to be indicated by the following quotation from a letter from Freud to Jung, written in April 1909. I shake my wise grey locks over the question of psychosynthesis, and I think, well, that is how the young folk are. They really enjoy things only when they need not drag us along with them, where with our short breath and weary legs we cannot follow. And as Lancelot Law White has written, Freud was the genius of conflict in the psyche, and he should be followed by the genius of order in the organism illustrated in the human mind. The last phrase precisely defines Assagioli's contribution, which has been increasingly appreciated and implemented in the past decade, when, on account of the loosening of the hold of socio-cultural orthodoxies and the awakened interest in consciousness expansion, adjustment therapy has been seen in its true light, and growth psychology has come into its own. Roberto Assagioli was 86 in the summer of 1974, when Diana Bacciatti went to work with him. When I went to Italy, Diana said, I thought I was going to learn psychosynthesis, and what I realized when he died was that I had been sent to serve Roberto in the last months of his life, to bring him joy and contact and humanness for his last month on earth. Because of his physical frailty, it had been months since he had agreed to take on a new student, though many had sought the privilege. But Diana went to him with the recommendation of Dr. Piero Ferrucci, his most loyal and brilliant ex-student, who normally worked with him, but was spending the summer in California with his aunt, Laura Huxley, wife of the late Aldous Huxley. Ferrucci's recommendation helped, but this alone does not explain Assagioli's taking her into his life. There was contact at depth from their first meeting the previous October, and now it seemed that Roberto knew that Diana had not come to take from him, but to give. Everyone around him, even his housekeeper and the secretary, who had worked for him for 25 years or so, tended to regard him as an eminence grise, to be very deferential, and always address him as Dr. Assagioli. His wife had died the year before, and his only son married many years ago. And Diana sensed that he was a lonely man who needed human contact, warmth, and affection. He was spending the summer in his villa in Capalona, in the hills of Tuscany, between Florence and Rome. The Instituto di Psychosynthesi had premises in Florence, above which he had an apartment, and in the summer months moved out to Capalona, where for many years students had visited him in his big old house known as Villa Lanusa. About 2 years ago, someone had built a Sicilian modern villa on top of a hill overlooking Capalona, which he named Villa Ilario, in memory of his son. And here he now lived with his housekeeper, Carmela, and his manservant, Dante. As the Villa Lanusa was empty, he suggested that Diana should live in it during her stay, and early in June she had moved in. Capalona itself is a rather unattractive small town. The streets are unpaved and there is a cement factory on its outskirts, and it lies in a valley. It is very hot and dusty in the summer. For Diana to walk past the outskirts of Capalona, as she did daily, then up the hill towards the Villa Ilario, was always something of a symbolic journey, a progress from the squalid and the mundane to the higher level of the spiritual. She would arrive about 11 o'clock every morning. Carmela was always busy in the kitchen, whence emanated homely smells of cooking. Roberto would be waiting in his study, a slight, frail man with white hair and beard. He always made a point of dressing elegantly, in a velvet smoking jacket of which he had several of different colors, and a clean white shirt and a tie. His study was an expression of the man, of his ideas and his loves. The furniture was sturdy and antique, and there were shelves full of books on every wall. On his desk was a small United Nations flag symbolizing the unity of mankind, and there were a number of rocks of interesting color or shape, including a large amethyst crystal. There were always fresh, fragrant roses in the room, for to him the rose was a symbol for the soul, and there were several antique vases and chalices symbolizing love. An artist's drawing of Mount Fuji wreathed in cloud and some enlarged photographs of the galaxies decorated the walls. The former a reminder of the heights the human spirit can attain, and the latter reminders of another perspective of human problems in relation to the immense and magnificence of the universe. Wide, tall windows which were open on warm days gave onto a veranda and commanded a view over the valley and several villages with terraced vineyards in the near distance and ranges of hills in the far. For about 2 hours each morning, Roberto and Diana would work in his study. He would dictate letters to her, to English or American correspondents, or they would spend time organizing material for a book he was composing on ways to the self, or, as he sometimes called it, a textbook of height psychology. As he was deaf and could only be communicated with directly if you shouted at the top of your voice in Italian, as his servants did, which always amused Diana, for he was a man of great dignity, and their shouting at him seemed so incongruous. She had to communicate with him by writing what she wished to say. After the morning's work they would meditate together for about half an hour. Roberto always went so far out in his meditations, Diana said, but he had to have something to bring him back, and for the purpose he used an egg timer that went off with such a loud noise that it always made me jump out of my skin, though to him, of course, it was just a gentle, muted ping. But in spite of the egg timer, she says, meditating with Roberto was like magic. He always came out of it with a tremendous sense of joy and light, of wonder and awe. In the afternoon, Roberto would rest, and Diana would return to Villa Lanusa to work at editing his papers. Then, at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, she would go back to Villa Ilario, and for another 2 or 3 hours Roberto would work with her on her own psychosynthesis, which would be followed by another period of meditation before Carmela served dinner. Day after day they followed this routine, and Diana knew that these weeks would be formative for her, that the experience of serving Roberto and learning from him would remain a cherished memory throughout her life. She looked forward to being able to share it with John when he came. John came to Italy from the Bahamas after a brief stopover in London, and stayed for 3 weeks with Diana in Villa Lanusa. He too had an experience to talk about and share. Diana knew little about the communications at this stage, for when they had last been together for a period, John had been heavily committed to the May lectures work and had given her only a vague idea of what he was otherwise involved in. But now he told her all, and what he told her aroused in her profound mixed feelings, in which fear predominated. Primarily the awesome fear of the unknown, but also fear that he was being deceived, was making a fool of himself, and fear for the future of their relationship, for she knew she would not be able to share his enthusiasm and his commitment to the extent that he might wish. John was eager to have Roberto's opinion of the communications, and he wrote a long report of events and information received up to that time for him to read. Fortunately, he recorded the remarks Assagioli made after he had read the report. Assagioli spoke English well, but jerkily and in a high-pitched voice with pronounced Italian inflections, which makes the tape difficult to transcribe. But after listening to it several times, phrase by phrase, I have been able to decipher the following interesting comments. Very pleased with the report because of the agreement between the communications, and my intuition is really remarkable. The main points should be a basis for our cooperation. Mediums are not always reliable because they are open to different influences and they cannot discriminate. The point which I really doubt is that of a physical landing of these beings. As regards the new wave from 1975 on and the coming of higher beings, I think it will be a gradual thing. But the main point is the realization by humanity that there are higher beings, which they are strangely reluctant to admit. I think that to help them to recognize that is good, and this is one of the main esoteric teachings. The time has come for the recognition of that, of the hierarchy that is there. The only point of caution is that there are dark forces that try to prevent all this happening, and one of their ways is to insinuate false teachings in the communications. It is not so difficult for them, for they are sly, and under the guise of something fine they can be misleading, so we must always be on guard. Assagioli was well versed in the esoteric traditions and teachings, and he could speak of the hierarchy of higher beings and of the dark forces that opposed them with complete naturalness, as if he had long ago accepted the reality of such entities. I shall have occasion to refer back to these remarks of Assagioli in later discussions of the communication. I should like to bring to the reader's attention also a very relevant passage from the chapter titled Crisis Caused by the Spiritual Awakening in his book, Psychosynthesis. In some sensitive individuals there is an awakening of parapsychological perceptions. They have visions which they believe to be of exalted beings. They may hear voices or begin to write automatically, accepting the messages at their face value and obeying them unreservedly. The quality of such messages is very varied. Sometimes they contain fine teachings, but they should always be examined with much discrimination and sound judgment, and without being influenced by their uncommon origin or by any claim by their alleged transmitter. No validity should be attributed to messages containing definite orders and commanding blind obedience, and to those tending to exalt the personality of the recipient. If we review the communications in the light of Assagioli's comments, both in his book and in response to John's report, we note that they cannot be faulted for commanding blind obedience, for the communicators repeatedly make the point that they never interfere with a person's free will, nor can they really be said to exalt the personalities of the recipients, for they stress that they are one of several groups in the world who have chosen to be in service, and also, as we shall see later, lay particular emphasis on the fact that they are ordinary human beings. What is most interesting, of course, is that Acciaiuoli found nothing intrinsically preposterous in the idea of communications emanating from an extraterrestrial intelligence. What he said about the unreliability of mediums and the possibility of false teaching being insinuated into communication must always be borne in mind when we attempt to assess this material. But it was a possibility that both Phyllis and Andrija were aware of, for Phyllis said to Andrija when she came out of trance at the conclusion of Rio's channeling, "Are you sure that we are dealing with the right people?" To a non-psychic who falls in with people involved in the psychic scene, it is impressive to find that they have a consensus reality. Intensely subjective through psychic and spiritual experiences are, they belong to an area of human experience that has been well mapped, and knowledge of the topography of this strange area is shared by psychics and psychologists. Freudian psychologists tend to lump psychic experiences together as products of morbid or pathological mental states, and Jung and Acciaiuoli were pioneers in taking psychism seriously and studying the varieties of its manifestations. In conversation with me, Diana said of Acciaiuoli, "We believed that certain things were lower psychism and certain things were higher, in the sense that lower psychism was astral projection, telepathy, clairvoyance, mediumship, whereas higher psychism was intuition, illumination, inspiration, and he felt very much that if we tune into and focus all our attention on the lower aspects of psychism, we won't allow the higher development to occur." What worried Diana about the communications and John's involvement was that she felt that there was a good deal of lower psychism involved in them. Acciaiuoli had similar reservations, but he was genuinely interested in the communications, and when John returned to Ossining in July, he promised to bring back to Italy a further report on what transpired in the next series of communications. He also promised to consult the management on the question whether it would be in order for a healing to be attempted on Roberto. Acciaiuoli had agreed to this, on the condition that no attempt should be made to cure his deafness, for he said he had lived with that condition long enough to have learned that it had certain advantages. Phyllis was already at Ossining when John arrived on the 18th of July. Lyle was due to come on the 20th, but Andrija said they had already learned from the management that he had decided against getting more deeply involved in the work. Andrija had held a communication alone with Phyllis the night before, in which Tom had said, "Dr. Watson was given an opportunity and declined. Many people ask, what can we do for mankind? And when we give directions, they fail, because they are afraid it will interfere. They ask, but they do not really mean it in their hearts. He may continue working if he desires, but we want you to remind him that he was given an opportunity. If he had said yes, he would not necessarily have had to do that project. We were asking for faith. He knew for the last 3 years that he would be involved in healing. Within his heart, this pleased him, but he asked for more, and we were willing to give this, but he was not willing to test us." Phyllis, Andrija, and John were all disappointed by this news. But in the same communication, there had been more encouraging news about Bobby. "He has made a commitment, but under certain conditions," Tom said. "In his heart, his commitment is made, but he's now trying to make us make a commitment to him. Things will be resolved and all your systems in motion by the middle of August. That was unexpected news, for when Phyllis had last seen Bobby in Orlando, he had not intimated that he was now willing to make his commitment to work with the group again. He had, however, tried to exercise his healing powers on Phyllis herself. On the 8th of July, Phyllis had had a heart attack. She had been in her office with two close friends when she had suddenly collapsed. They had driven her round to her doctor, who had immediately sent her to hospital, where she was in intensive care for 4 days. When the worst of the crisis was over and she was convalescing, she had had an argument with the doctor about smoking, and by threatening to discharge herself from the hospital and convincing him that the stress she underwent without cigarettes was likely to cause a relapse, she managed to prevail upon him to allow her 4 or 5 cigarettes a day. The doctor therefore arranged for her to be moved to another room, immediately next to the intensive care unit, where although she was alone, she was still under continual observation, for she was wired to electronic monitoring equipment. She was supposed to remain in bed all the time and call a nurse if she needed anything, but on the second day she got bored and wondered what would happen if she detached the belts that connected her to the electronic devices. She did so and nobody came to investigate, so she took the opportunity to go to the toilet. The next day she had become more adventurous and left the room for about 20 minutes to take a shower, and still nobody seemed to have noticed her absence. She thought it extraordinarily inefficient, for a nurse was supposed to be keeping an eye on the monitoring equipment in the next room, but she wasn't disposed to complain, and she continued to enjoy her surreptitious daily excursions throughout the rest of her convalescence. She soon felt fully recovered. Among the tests she was put through before being finally discharged was one on a running machine. Her heartbeat was monitored while she ran, and the doctor was amazed at the steadiness of the beat and at the length of time that she kept up the running. He told her she seemed to have more than recovered, and that she had the heart of a girl of 20. He was obviously very puzzled. The doctor and the hospital staff were even more puzzled on the day she left. Phyllis only heard the story 3 days later from the superintendent of nurses, who was an acquaintance of hers. Apparently, she had left the hospital. The electrocardium had continued giving a readout of her heartbeat as if she was still wired to the machine. Technicians were called to check the machine for faults. They dismantled it and put it together again, and it still went on recording Phyllis' heartbeat. It continued to do so, in fact, for 8 hours after she had left the hospital. Twice while she was in hospital, Bobby had tried to get in to see her, and had managed to do so briefly on one occasion, masquerading as a relative who had come a long way to pay the visit. He had attempted to do a healing, but had been allowed little time, and it was doubtful that Phyllis' recovery was due to his efforts. There were so many unusual elements in the case that Andrija had asked for an explanation during the communication he held alone with Phyllis on the 17th of July. "We are sorry that we have to inconvenience her," Tom had said, "but we decided this was the best way. We had much work to do. Phyllis had been getting too little rest and had been generating too much energy inwards, which had weakened the heart. So we decided that this being needed to be brought down so that we could repair and fix the heart at the same time. Her heart was now as good as when she was a child," Tom went on, "and also its function and composition had been changed. It is a method not known in your world," he said, and tried to explain that the heart now had 9 sorts of antennae, which functioned both as sensors and transducers. "What it will do is filter the energy. Part of it will filter the energy, part of it will be used as a satellite for us, and it filters and purifies the blood. Energy can then be dissipated into the ether without a blowout." Andrija asked whether the abnormal reactions on the hospital equipment were due to this energy, and Tom replied, "This is correct. The energy that we use radiates out from this being. We have talked to you before about the sonars. heart implants mentioned by Rear in the communication held on Stocking Island on the 21st of June, this sonar continues to radiate after it is activated. It is also the same principle as is used in healing. When we use these beings for healings, after the healing or the actual physical contact has taken place, then the healing continues. The sonars continue to radiate out for approximately 8 to 24 hours of your hours. Nobody in the world seems to have known this, Andrija said wonderingly. Nobody before has hooked one of our beings into one of these machines, Tom said. In the same communication, Tom had spoken at some length about the relation between sexual and spiritual energies. Being involved in the type of work they were all involved in, he had said, tended to activate sexual energy and desire to a high degree. It is obvious that we need tremendous help in this area, Andrija said, for it seems to be the main obstacle to our carrying out the commitments that we make. You must understand that I do not understand that emotion, Tom said. But he apparently managed to get some help from colleagues better acquainted with the problems of physical beings, for after a long pause he went on. They are explaining to me that there is nothing wrong with this emotion, but if the being is not able to transmute the vibration, it becomes like a furnace that is stoked. And a furnace must have a safety valve. The refined way of doing this would be to elevate the energy or to walk off the steam. Within all of you there is a pipeline, and if the energy is not funneled upwards so that the steam can be released properly, it is then becomes a heart-burning furnace. If you let off too much steam from the furnace, it dissipates the energy of that furnace, and it is no longer as functional as it should be. This is the problem in your physical world. There's too much involvement in releasing the energy instead of refining the energy. What this amounted to, of course, was an advocacy of sublimation instead of satiation of sexual desires. And although it was not particularly original, it was apparently particularly relevant to Andrija, for the following day he made a decision to terminate a liaison which he knew had been jeopardizing his work. John also made a decision on the same morning, the 20th of July. Here is how he described it. Early in the morning, while in bed, I got to thinking about my frustration with the wealthy people I know who claim to be committed, yet still do not give money, even though they know it is urgently needed. I realized that whilst I had given a lot of money, I had not, in so doing, endangered my own financial security. So in real terms, I had given nothing. I felt that that indicated some lack of faith in myself and in God, and that if I overcame that, my frustration would go away, for it is, of course, frustration with myself and not with others. I also believed that money would only begin to flow from others when I had dealt with my hang-up about it. When I honestly faced my problem in this way, it simply melted away, and I was overwhelmed with a sense of relief, joy, and peace. There was indeed a need for further injection of funds into the work, not only to cover the considerable living and travelling expenses of the group, but also to carry out some of the projects that were being mooted. In the communications taking place over the next 2 days, there was to be talk of making 3 films, one about Andrija's life, another about Acidioli, and the third, Tom said, will be about us and will include Bobby. And also there was to be a research project launched with the children with paranormal powers, and a TV program to be made on the subject. It was all work that would require some funding, and though John felt that his problem and his frustrations melted away, when he thought about them, they were to reoccur at intervals in the future. So I beg here a break. Have a good Monday, 17th of February.